That's a myth that's being spread only in Washington, D.C.
About the federal building in Portland be standing today if you had not deployed federal law enforcement?
I don't think so. There have been multiple attempts to set it afire.
Yeah,
and I have to say I don't understand why a small contingent of marshals inside the court poses a threat to anybody's First Amendment rights. They set up a fence on federal property, I am told, around the court, and when people are arrested, it's because they're trying to come into the fence. These aren't peaceful protesters. They bring power tools to cut through the wire and so forth to get in. This is a very strange occupation of a city when you have, 100, 120 federal people behind a fence trying to protect the building, and all these people are trying to cut their way in. That is the occupation of a city?
Thank you. Did the Chicago Fraternal Order of Police president ask for your help?
Did who ask for my help?
The head of the FOP in Chicago. Did they ask for your help?
I think he did.
Previous exchange, they talked about Mr. Horowitz's report. Is there anything you'd like to add? You didn't get a chance to respond to that.
Yeah, my understanding of my recollection of the report is it didn't find there was no bias. And he made that clear in subsequent testimony. What he said was he couldn't find no documentary or other evidence demonstrating bias.
Yeah, and what would be helpful if maybe Mr. Horowitz could come in front of this committee and the individual who was raising that concern with you, Mr. Attorney General, could ask Mr. Horowitz himself about what he found in that report and subsequent reports that we have not yet had a hearing on.
The gentleman's time has expired, Mr. Raskin.
Are you aware that the rector of the church, that the Episcopal Archbishop of Washington and the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church nationally, along with the Catholic bishop of the Archdiocese of Washington, all denounced this police assault on the civil rights and civil liberties of the people?
Did they do that before or after the fire was put out?
Well, all the down those public health orders. Here's what Dr. Fauci was warning us about 3 months ago about the premature abandonment of health orders. If only you had listened. He said, I feel if that occurs, there is a real risk you will trigger an outbreak and you may not be able to control it, which in fact paradoxically...
We were not taking down public health orders. We were making narrow...
The gentleman's time is
we were calling attention to the fact...
Will you restore my time because this witness is speaking over my time?
You went over time. Let the witness respond.
He's trying to...
Gentleman's time has expired. Who seeks recognition?
Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We do have a governor in Virginia who is engaged in overreach, particularly regarding the civil rights of Virginians and their expression of their religious faith. So I want to give the Attorney General the opportunity to respond to the gentleman from Maryland.
We adopted a very narrow approach of calling to the attention, usually by letter, not by lawsuit, of situations where they were treating religion worse than they were other kinds of organizations and gatherings, and the Constitution requires that it be treated the same. And we were calling those to the attention of the governors, and most of the governors that we called attention to voluntarily changed their own orders. There are a few occasions where we pointed out anomalies in the differential regulation of business, and again, mostly they were voluntarily changed by the governors. So this was not a wholesale attack on stay-at-home orders. It was just that these are very broad powers that have been ceded, basically telling everyone to stay at home and only work if you're an essential business and so forth. And therefore, someone has to keep an eye on that and make sure there's no overreach. And as time went by, there were times where, that you had these crazy rules in effect that were overly burdensome and raised constitutional problems.
I want to thank you for raising those points early, and particularly with regard to Virginia and the church out on the Eastern Shore. I want to thank you also for being here and for returning to lead the Department of Justice and right the ship and root out the rank partisanship and bias that had corrupted the administration of justice for many years. The Democrats allege that Attorney General Barr has politicized the Justice Department doing the personal bidding of President Trump, but it's not only unfounded, it's especially hypocritical in light of the politicization that occurred during the Obama-Biden administration and led by President Obama's self-described wingman, Attorney General Eric Holder. The Obama-Biden Justice Department investigated journalists, shut out career prosecutors, and flouted congressional oversight. I want to ask, particularly, even after President Trump assumed office, FBI lawyers exhibited bias against Trump while working for both Mueller and the FBI's Russia investigation, and the Inspector General couldn't rule out political animus against candidate Trump as influencing FBI abuse, correct?
That's my understanding.
The Inspector General found that an FBI lawyer altered evidence to support a FICE application to surveil Carter Page and criminally referred this lawyer to Durham for federal prosecution. The same lawyer who also worked on the investigations into Clinton's misuse of classified information and Russia collusion expressed bias against President Trump. And the Inspector General testified back in December that he can't rule out bias. Mr. Attorney General, I'd ask, what would the consequences be to one of your Justice Department lawyers if they doctored underlying documents so they could support evidence submitted to a federal court?
In the abstract, talking generally, that lawyer would be fired.
Would they likely be disbarred as well?
Yes.
And isn't it true that the IG found that an FBI lawyer doctored an email to support probable cause against candidate Trump's campaign aide?
I think that's right.
And the same FBI lawyer worked on the Russia investigation targeting candidate Trump's campaign and was on the special counsel Mueller team investigating President Trump, correct?
I'm not sure about that.
And while working on those investigations, the Inspector General found several texts showing that animus, correct?
On that particular lawyer? I believe so.
Yes.
I can't remember the time frame of the text, but I know there were other texts.
I'm going to talk to you about the unmasking that occurred where Mr. Grinnell released a list of 39 officials who submitted a request to unmask the identity of General Flynn from November 8th, 2016 to January 31st, 2017. 49 requests were submitted. Is that a normal number of requests for unmasking?
I mean, historically, that seems to be a high number, and the other question you have to ask is why was this after the election?
And 7 Treasury officials, including Secretary of the Treasury Jacob Lew, Deputy Secretary Sarah Raskin. Is that a normal occurrence?
There are times where high-level officials can do it. I don't know enough about the specifics.
Can you yield the remainder of my time to Mr. Jordan?
Mr. Attorney General, what's more important, going to church or going to a protest?
It depends on the individual.
Both covered under the First Amendment, right?
Right.
Yeah, what's more important, going to work or going to a protest?
Again, it depends on the individual. We're all free. We can all make our choices.
I'm talking about government limits on those activities. What's more important, government putting limits on protesting or government's putting limit on attending church?
Are they both First Amendment?
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. And we should treat them the same, shouldn't we?
Right.
Gentleman's time has expired. Ms. Jayapal.
American citizens who were just simply exercising their First Amendment rights was appropriate?
Well, first, it's my understanding that no tear gas was used on Monday, June 1st.
Mr. Barr, that is a semantic distinction that has been proven false by many fact checkers.
How is it semantic?
Do you think?
How is it semantic? Tear gas is a particular compound.
You talked about chemical irritants, and it has been proven false by reports. So just answer the question. Do you think that it was appropriate at Lafayette Park to pepper spray, tear gas, and beat protesters and injure American citizens?
Well, I don't accept your characterization of what happened, but as I explained, the effort there was...
Mr. Barr, I just asked for a yes or no, so let me just tell you, I'm starting to lose my temper. According to sworn testimony before the House Natural Resources Committee by Army National Guard officer Adam DeMarco, who was there, this was, quote, an unprovoked escalation and excessive use of force against peaceful protesters.
Well, I don't remember DeMarco as being...
Mr. Barr, excuse me,
being involved in any of the decision-making.
Sir, The president told governors strongly. Do you remember that call, Mr. Barr?
Yes, I do. But he wasn't talking about protesters. He was talking
Mr.
about
Barr,
rioters.
apparently the president believes that you can be activated. Protesters called for the governor to be lynched, shot, and beheaded. So obviously you couldn't be concerned about that.
Well, there are a lot of protests around the United States, and on June
Attorney
1st,
General
I
Barr,
was worried
you
about
seem
the
to be
District of
engaging
Columbia,
in
which is
protests
federal.
in certain parts of the country. You're very aware of those, but when protesters with guns and swastikas and
I am
Confederate
aware of
flags. Excuse me,
protesters in
Mr.
the
Barr, this
federal
is
government.
my time, and I control it. You are aware of certain Mr. Barr.
I have responsibility for the federal government, and the White House is the seat of the executive
Mr. Barr, let me
branch,
just make it clear. You are supposed to
the Michigan
represent
authorities
the
can
people
handle
of the United
Michigan
States
authorities
of
can
America,
handle-
not violate people's First Amendment rights. You are supposed to uphold democracy and secure equal justice under the law, not violently
Thank you,
dismiss.
AG Barr, for being here today. I truly appreciate it, and I'm sincere when I say it's an honor.
Yeah.
AG Barr, let me just...
Could I just ask you for 1 minute, though?
To respond, yes.
Yeah. As I made clear, moving H Street out to I Street as the perimeter was a decision made the day before. It was justified by the extreme rioting that was going on around the White House. I don't remember Captain DeMarco, who was the same Captain DeMarco who ran as a Democratic candidate for Congress in Maryland, even being close to the discussions as to what was going on. Now, the fact is that the movement was not geared to the behavior of that particular crowd. It was geared to the fact that we were moving the perimeter out so we could put a fence up on H Street, by H Street. But it is a fact that the Park Police reported, and I saw myself projectiles being thrown from that crowd. So I did not consider them all peaceful protesters. But I'm sorry. Thank you for giving me that opportunity.
You're welcome, AG Barr. AG Barr, I'd like to also talk about the violent protests that are being seen in Seattle, specifically Chaz, and also Portland, Oregon. As you know, over the course of June and early July, several shootings occurred inside Seattle's police-free zone, including the tragic murders of a 16-year-old and a 19-year-old. There were numerous reports of robberies, assaults, and property destruction as well.
Sexual assaults as well.
Yes, and despite all this chaos, all this violence, it took the Seattle mayor literally weeks to declare this an unlawful gathering, and took weeks before the police were allowed to clear that area. In similar circumstances, let's talk about Portland, Oregon. It's been going through 8 weeks of violent rioting in the streets as well. Rioters continue, in fact, to fire projectiles and mortar-style fireworks at federal law enforcement officers, and are using dangerous lasers, which have already permanently blinded at least 3 federal officers. Yet our own Chairman Jerry Nadler, told a reporter on Sunday that the anarchy and violence going on in Portland, and I quote the chairman, is a myth that is spread only in Washington, D.C., end quote. Attorney General Barr, is it in fact a myth that there's anarchy and anarchist groups engaging in violence in Portland?
I think there are anarchist and far left groups that are involved in the violence in Portland. I actually think that the chairman's comment was about Antifa. I don't know exactly what he said, but I thought he was referring to Antifa.
Well, do you think it's a myth that Antifa is involved in this anarchy?
No, I think Antifa is involved in Portland.
So either way, the chairman's comments were not correct, were not accurate.
I didn't consider them accurate.
What about the autonomous zone in Seattle? Congresswoman Jayapal has said, and I quote, that it's a peaceful protest zone. Is it a peaceful protest zone?
No. As I already said, it's outrageous that, people set themselves up and over a piece of territory where the people in there have not selected them as the government and try to exercise sovereign authority. That's an outrage. And we saw people handing out guns to people to, quote, keep the peace and so forth. It was anarchy there.
Your office has already charged several violent protesters with federal crimes. Can you just briefly elaborate on those crimes?
Well, they're the whole gamut. I think I think we've had 224. They run the gamut from throwing Molotov cocktails to, assaulting a police officer, that kind of thing.
Thank you, AG Barr. I just want to say that I think, and I don't know if you agree, that Chaz and Portland are really like political experiments. They really show us what would happen if we fully embrace the radical ideology of the social justice Democrats. And now, according to Democrats, it's the summer of love. According to the Congresswoman that represents Seattle, it's a peaceful protest zone. Attorney General Barr, in reality, these cities are experiencing violence, chaos, and frankly, just anarchy. So I think this political experiment has showed us that the liberal, social justice, Democrat-style government has failed. Would you like to comment on that, Attorney General Barr?
Well, when I was first going through confirmation, I expressed concern about violence getting into our political system, and we'd seen this intolerance and attacking people, and I was very worried about that. And now we've seen it sweeping through the country like this, and I hope the Democratic Party takes a stand against the violence. Yes,
Thank you.
And someone mentioned my comment about we shouldn't permit resistance. We shouldn't take that as a matter of course. But I never suggest that just because someone resists, that justifies whatever's done.
Thank you so much for that, because good police officers also believe that they're held to a higher standard. So I'm glad to hear you say that. As a former police detective, I've solved many cases based on patterns of behavior, and there is an alarming pattern, I believe, that's developing. It appears, Mr. Barr, every time a U.S. attorney investigates the president or those close to him, he or she is removed and replaced by one of your friends. You have removed U.S. attorneys in the Eastern District of New York, the District of Columbia, and the Eastern District of Texas. On June 19th, you announced Mr. Berman would be stepping down. Now, let me just be clear. When you told America that Mr. Berman was stepping down, did Mr. Berman tell you he was stepping down?
No.
Okay.
But stepping down is the language that I'm told.
He did not tell you that.
No.
Okay,
but it's the language we usually use to leave flexibility as to whether the person is doing it on their own.
On June 20th, when asked about the basis for Mr. Berman's removal, on the very day you announced he was being fired, stepping down, the president's personal attorney, Mr. Giuliani, suggested that, and I quote, "The reason may lie in the fact that Berman's office got involved in what Giuliani described as baseless investigations." Sir, if that wasn't true, if you didn't remove Mr. Berman because he was overseeing investigations of the president and those close to him, why would the president's personal attorney think that?
I'm sorry, what did he say and when? I didn't hear the quote.
Mr. Giuliani suggests that...
When?
June 20th. June 20th. That he may have been fired because he was investigating baseless investigations.
Well, if he said that, that's nonsense. Number one, anyone familiar with the Department of Justice would say that removing a component head is not going to have any effect on any pending investigation.
Okay, and I know you're aware of reports that Berman's office was in fact investigating the president's former personal attorney, Mr. Cohen, his current personal attorney, Mr. Giuliani, his current personal attorney's associates, and his presidential inauguration. Well, Mr. Barr,
I don't mean to suggest just by my silence that I'm confirming that. That seems to be your opinion.
Okay, all right. Have you in any way attempted to influence or interfere with any investigation in the Southern District, including the investigations I just mentioned?
I've not interfered in any investigation. I've raised questions on occasion about certain matters, but as far as I'm aware, the office was satisfied with the resolution.
Your efforts to remove him bypassed the normal operation of law. Now we know the OLC opinion indicates that a sitting president cannot be indicted or criminally prosecuted, because you made sure President Trump understood that in your 19-page or however long job application. However, you are aware the special counsel confirmed that a sitting president can be investigated. You did read that in the special counsel's report. Is that correct?
Yes.
Given Mr. Trump's residence and former business location, the Southern District, Berman's office would have decision-making authority over whether to investigate the president in himself, and you removed him.
I've explained why I removed him.
Okay, sitting here today under penalty of perjury, do you still maintain, as you stated in a February 13th interview, that the president has never asked you to do anything in a criminal case? Yes or no, please?
Yeah, no. I mean, will I confirm it? Is that the question?
Do you stand by your testimony or your...
He has never asked me, directed me, pressured me to do anything in a criminal case.
Okay, all right.
And I want us to talk specifically about what's going on in Portland with you, Mr. Attorney General, because for 61 nights, the federal courthouse is under siege. But not just the courthouse. Federal agents are under siege. You have men and women there protecting that courthouse. Now, I have no doubt if they were there, that courthouse would not be standing right now. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely.
And I think one of our problems is how we talk about this and how it's covered versus what is actually going on every single night in Portland at that courthouse. Can you explain what your officers and your agents are going through over there?
Yes. I'm talking about the U.S. Marshals who were in the courthouse. They have initially tried to contain themselves in the courthouse. There have been efforts to push through in the main door. When people have succeeded in breaching the courthouse, they have thrown kerosene and fireworks and started fires. So then the effort was to make sure that they cannot breach. There still have been breaches into the courthouse. But basically, they try to remain in there. And starting after the 4th, they tried to arrest the people who were directing fireworks. They would climb up onto the side of the court, break windows, shoot fireworks in. And whenever the marshals came out to try to put an end to that or interdict it, they were shot at with slingshots. Lasers were constantly being put into their eyes even when they're inside the courthouse. There's a good description of it in an AP story.
I was just going to quote that. We don't have to take your word. I watched as injured officers were hauled inside. In one case, the commercial firework came over so fast the officer didn't have time to respond. It burned through his sleeve, and he had bloody gashes on both forearms. Another had a concussion from being hit in the head with a mortar.
Right. That's right. And, we've had a lot of injuries out there, and these are people who this Congress has charged with protecting federal courts. They're directed to protect federal courts in the U.S. Code, and they are under attack. And they're being injured, and it's been constant for 60 days.
Acting Secretary Wolf has said that the violent mobs are publishing personal information of federal officers, jeopardizing not only them, but their families. Why is doxing federal agents so dangerous, and are you concerned about it?
Well, it's dangerous because people can take retaliation against their homes, their families, or them. When they're by themselves. I see some of these Latin American countries in Central America where the police are very, very brave because the gangs they're trying to deal with go to their houses and kill their families. And you never think that could happen here, but you could never think some of the stuff we're seeing today could ever happen here.
Is being burned by essentially improvised explosive device, being blinded by lasers, is this something that typically happens with federal marshals in federal courthouses?
No, not at all.
How is this handled? How is this going for recruitment, morale? How are they doing? I mean, I generally want to know, how are they doing?
Well, I think that AP story gives you a feel. They feel that's their duty, and they feel that's where they have to be. A number of them are from that area, but they're extremely tired, and we've had to rotate in some more. We're put in some more people because they're very, very tired, and you make mistakes when you're tired.
Well, and I think that's an important part, because I think one of the most amazing parts of this whole thing, it started with under 30 agents there, and now it's still under 100. 61 nights in a row, they defend against a siege, fires, burning down these things. You know what's the most amazing thing? They get up every morning, and that courthouse is still running. They're still conducting the federal government's business. So I'm going to say something that I think should be said a lot more often. Tell them thank you. Tell the courthouse personnel thank you. Tell the clerks thank you. Tell the prosecutors thank you. Tell the judges thank you. And if you can handle it, can you tell the public defenders thank you too? Because they're still conducting the business. They do this every single night. Are they getting sleep?
The marshals are having a difficult time because their demonstrators go to the hotel. They also go from hotel to hotel because the demonstrators try to disrupt their sleep at the hotel.
And there's a difference between a protest and a riot. Every night at some point in time in Portland, it turns into a riot. Eventually, when you wake up the next morning and you know what's going to happen again, then we need to figure out a way to stop it. Yeah. And then just one last question. Why would we have to negotiate a ceasefire with a peaceful protest?
You're correct. But why would, that's right. Well, we don't want, what we would like to see, and all we would like, is what we see in the rest of the country, which is state and local law enforcement taking care of their own city and taking care of the streets around the courthouse.
The gentleman's time has expired.
Are undocumented people not whole individuals?
Are not what?
Are undocumented individuals in this country not whole people?
They are obviously people, but the legal issue there was the terminology of the Constitution.
Well, if I may,
it reflects the decision at the time of the Constitution that they count inhabitants.
If I may reclaim my time, sir. You used to work for the Department of Justice back in 1989. There was a letter written to Senator Jeff Bingham by the DOJ on point. If there's a slide, there's a letter, and I would ask unanimous consent to admit that to the record.
Without objection.
And I quote, in the past, the Department of Justice has taken the position that Section 2 of the 14th Amendment, that the original apportionment
the department advised is that this came up because Alabama claims you cannot count illegal aliens in the census under the Constitution. The department looked at it and advised that Congress can determine the meaning of inhabitant for this purpose, that it is not a self-defining term as they
only got 2 minutes, sir.
That they recognized.
Mr. Barr, if I may.
Yeah, but this is a hearing. I thought I was the one that was supposed to be heard.
Well, and I'm going to get there. The current dispute, you talked back when the Supreme Court struck down the president's.
I'm going to ask you a question about Mr. Burnell Trammell from Milwaukee here in just a minute. He was the man who was shot to death at the end of last week. He's the African-American man who was wearing a sign, and he's regularly known around Milwaukee for carrying a Trump for President sign. But I want to share with you what happened in Madison, Wisconsin, so we all understand that this is not a myth about Antifa. So when the riots hit Minneapolis and then extended around the country, they hit Madison, Wisconsin also. And I don't know if you've ever visited Madison, Wisconsin. There's an iconic street there called State Street. Starts at the Capitol and runs all the way down to the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And that street, if you go there now, 75 businesses are boarded up as a result of a mayor and city council who would not protect those people. Those people went to the city council last week and they asked for some assistance. The city council, who would not protect their business, they said, no, we're not going to provide you for assistance. Shortly after State Street was destroyed, and by the way, it's disappointing in some of the film that I've seen that the police cruiser that went flaming down State Street was not included in that. But shortly after that, about a week afterwards, two monuments at the state capitol that I used to walk by all the time were torn down. One was of Hans Christian Heg, who was the abolitionist Norwegian immigrant who died at Chickamauga defending the Union and providing for the end of slavery, fighting for the end of slavery here in the United States. The other monument that was torn down, by the way, they took a tow truck and tore it down, was Lady Forward. Lady Forward is there because of women's suffrage. Wisconsin was the first state to pass suffrage back in the early 1900s here in the United States of America. Those were torn down. Just yesterday, a woman, a social worker, who teaches at a local school just outside Madison in Mount Horeb. She was charged with beating a state senator, a Democrat state senator. Her name is Samantha Hamer. Hopefully she will be given justice. But I want to emphasize to my colleagues on the left that if you think you're insulated from Antifa, which is supposedly a myth, you should really think about that, because them and other radicals, they will not spare violence on anyone. Their anarchy is meant to destroy our country. And I would ask you to, if you want to contact a former colleague of mine, State Senator Tim Carpenter, a Democrat, he'll tell you he was beat to a pulp on that night at midnight when they were tearing down those statues. It is not a myth. So, Mr. Attorney General, I would ask Mr. Bernal Trammell, I don't know if our Attorney General Call in Wisconsin or the mayor of Milwaukee are going to pursue what appears to perhaps be a political execution. Are you familiar with that situation in Milwaukee?
You mean the shooting of that gentleman?
Yes.
I've read about it.
If the Attorney General and other law enforcement in Wisconsin do not act, will the federal government study this situation and bring justice for Mr. Trammell and his family?
Yes, we'll certainly study that situation.
This is not a myth. You're hearing it from all over the country, and we're hearing all the time about Portland and Seattle. This happened in Madison, Wisconsin also, where a mayor, a far leftist mayor, proudly carries that banner, sat on a street, actually not a street, a highway with protesters, and shut down traffic. And then State Street, one of the most iconic streets in the state of Wisconsin and in Madison, was destroyed. And I'm not so sure that those businesses are going to get their businesses back. It is not a myth, folks. What's happening is real across our country, and we need to stop the riots. These are not peaceful protests. These are riots that are happening, and we need to call an end to it. And I hope you, Mr. Attorney General, will work towards that end.
Thank you.
Election, correct? You did that in at least 3 interviews?
Yes.
Okay. But in fact, you have no evidence that foreign countries can successfully sway our elections with counterfeit ballots, do you?
No, I don't, but I have common sense.
Okay. Well, and that's what you responded when you were directly impossible, preposterous, would never happen, and would be readily detected due to the multiple levels of security used with mail-in ballot systems?
There are not multiple levels of security.
Okay, well, so
and I don't agree. I don't agree that it's a
Okay, reclaiming my time. And again, I'm happy to supply you with the statements that were
before
provided
Donald
from around the
Trump
country.
raised concerns about
In
it. Every
fact,
major publication.
Reclaiming my time, sir. I've repeatedly warned that those adversaries are actively trying to sow mistrust of our election systems, and by repeating disinformation about mail-in voting, you and the president are helping them. Just switching gears, you would agree.
Well, I'd like an opportunity to respond to that.
You would agree that prosecutors who make political contributions are identifying fairly strongly with a political party, wouldn't you?
Who makes contributions?
You said in 2017 that prosecutors who make political contributions are identifying fairly strongly with a political party, correct?
Yes.
And in fact, you and your wife have donated over $730,000 to Republican and conservative candidates, including donations of $58,000 to Republican senators and Senate candidates in the 4 months preceding your confirmation. That's correct,
Are you surprised I'm a Republican?
Is that correct that you made those donations?
Over a long period of time.
Including just before. Okay.
That's a cumulative of a long period of time, but basically I never hid the fact I'm a Republican. I was talking about career prosecutors have generally historically avoided making contributions, was my view.
$730,000 is not...
Time of the gentlelady has expired.
Mr. Chairman, I would equal justice under the law. It's not the law that you and I both learned in law school. It is two simple systems of justice, one for the president's friend
and one for everyone else.
The director of the BOP.
It is flat wrong.
Yeah,
Thank you, and I yield back.
Yeah, the director of the BOP testified under oath that no one from Justice Department was involved.
Gentlelady yields back.
Yeah, but the gentleman has not been given an opportunity to respond, and that's a consistent problem.
Mr. Neguse is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, Mr. Attorney General. I want to go through a couple of your prior statements. On April 18th of 2019, you stated, quote, that the White House fully cooperated with the special counsel's investigation. You're aware of that?
Mm-hmm.
Today, yes or no, Mr. Barr, under the penalty of perjury, do you testify that that statement was true at the time you made it?
I thought it to be true at the time I made it.
Why
isn't it true?
June 9th, I'll get to that, Mr. Barr.
I mean, does it have
Mr.
to
Barr,
do with quibbling
I will get
over?
to that. Reclaiming my time, you answered the question.
Okay.
I have another question for you. On June 19th of
No,
2020.
actually, I need to answer that question.
Mr. Attorney General, you did answer the question.
No, you said under penalty of perjury. I'm going to answer the damn question. Okay?
You said the answer was yes, is what you said.
Well,
are you saying no?
I think what I was referring to, and I'd have to see the context of it, was the supplying of documents.
No, Mr. Attorney General, the statement was not limited to the supply of documents. You stated at a press conference, Mr. Attorney General, reclaiming my time. Reclaiming my time.
I think that's what I was talking about.
On April 19th of 2019 that the White House fully cooperated with the special counsel's investigation. You knew when you made that statement that
he may not have known it, but he was stepping down.
He may not have known that he was stepping down. That's your testimony today?
He was being removed.
Mr. Attorney General, the statement did not say that he was being removed. It did not say that he was being fired. It said that he was stepping down. And apparently your testimony today is that that was in fact accurate when Mr. Berman has testified under oath to this committee that it in fact was not. Now I want to talk about
No, he was removed. He was removed, and I wanted an opportunity to offer him another job.
I understand your rationalization for your answer, but the American people
not a
will let your
rationalization.
answer speak for itself. Now, Mr. Attorney General, earlier this year, President Trump stated that he had planned to make what he described as Vice President's, quote, Ukraine dealings. You concede there isn't anything standard about the Attorney General creating a special process for information related to advancing.
I disagree.
You disagree.
And I also made it clear that that is a vetting process that's available to anybody.
Is that right? Which U.S. attorney have you assigned to receive information from Vice President Biden's personal lawyers regarding President Trump?
Well, maybe if they had vetted the dossier,
there's no.
Maybe if they vetted the dossier, we wouldn't have the whole.
Mr. Attorney General,
problem.
There's no U.S. attorney, of course, that you've appointed to do that because what you have done with respect to this process is unprecedented. Now,
it was cautionary so that we do not pollute the criminal investigative process with Ukrainian disinformation.
I will give you an opportunity to explain this intake process. My understanding is that you have directed.
You are going to give me an opportunity?
I intend to right now. The Eastern District of New York, the U.S. attorney responsible for that district, my understanding is that you have asked that U.S. attorney to be responsible for the intake process. Is that right?
No.
That's wrong? The U.S. attorney?
The U.S. attorney in the Eastern District was given oversight of all Ukrainian-related cases, any new cases involving Ukraine.
Correct.
We face a problem with Ukraine, which is unreliable information coming in. There's a lot of corruption there. It's a hall of mirrors.
Mr. Attorney General,
and I wanted to make sure that before we got into criminal proceedings, and this was to everyone's benefit, particularly Vice President
Mr. Attorney
Biden,
General,
that the information was scrubbed in conjunction with the intelligence community.
And that is consistent with the memo that you issued, which said, any and all new matters relating to Ukraine shall be directed exclusively to the Eastern District of New York for investigation and appropriate handling, just as you've described right now. Now, of course, the U.S. attorney responsible in the Eastern District of New York was recently changed. My understanding is a few weeks ago you announced that Seth Ducharme would be taking over to replace Rich Donahue. Mr. Ducharme, prior
Pittsburgh is in charge of the vetting.
Mr. Attorney General, prior to taking this position, Mr. Ducharme worked at Maine Department of Justice. Is that correct?
Yes, he was a counselor to me, and then he was the principal assistant deputy attorney general.
That's right. And rather than having the acting U.S. attorney, the deputy U.S. attorney rather in that district,
they wanted to swap jobs.
You now have appointed your prior counsel to oversee that very same process. With that, I yield back my time, Mr. Chairman.